The auditorium was packed. Hundreds of students, parents, and educators filled the seats, their eyes fixed on the man standing at the podium. Ricardo Alvarez adjusted the microphone, his hands trembling slightly, not with fear, but with the weight of the moment. The crowd erupted into applause as his name was announced. And now, please welcome our Teacher of the Year, Mr. Ricardo Alvarez. Ricardo took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the audience. Faces beamed with admiration, but in the corner of his mind, he couldn't help but think about the journey that had brought him here. He cleared his throat, his voice steady yet tinged with emotion. When I was a boy, I was told I was nothing. They called me stupid, uneducated, and a waste of space. They said someone like me could never succeed. The room fell silent. Even the rustling of programs and the faint hum of whispers ceased. Ricardo's words gripped the audience, pulling them into his story. But those voices didn't break me. They fueled me. And today, I stand before you as proof that they were wrong. The applause was deafening, but Ricardo's mind drifted back to where it all began. A tiny, sun-scorched village in Mexico, where dreams felt like distant fantasies. Ricardo Alvarez grew up in a small, dusty village where opportunities were as scarce as rain. The single classroom in the town was a place he loved more than anything. While other children ran through the fields during breaks, Ricardo would sit under a tree with his nose buried in a borrowed book. Education, to him, was magic, a way to escape the limitations of his world. But his father, Carlos, didn't see it that way. "Books won't feed us, Ricardo," Carlos would bark, his voice heavy with frustration as he unloaded sacks of corn from the cart. "Get out to the fields and help your brothers." Ricardo's mother, Maria, often tried to soften the blow. Late at night, when Ricardo returned from a long day of labor, she'd sit with him under the glow of a single oil lamp. "Your mind is your greatest tool, mijo," she'd whisper, smoothing his hair. "One day, it will take you far." Despite his mother's encouragement, Ricardo's dreams were constantly undermined by the world around him. His classmates teased him, calling him the little professor in mocking tones. At just 12 years old, his dreams were cut short when his father pulled him out of school permanently. "We can't afford for you to waste time learning," Carlos declared one evening, his face hard as stone. "This family needs your hands, not your books." On his last day of school, Ricardo's teacher, Senorita Lopez, gave him a small, tattered book, a collection of poems. "Keep this," she said, her eyes glistening. "Never stop learning, Ricardo. You're meant for more." Ricardo clutched the book to his chest as he walked home, tears streaming down his face. The weight of his father's expectations crushed him, but deep inside, a spark of defiance began to grow. He vowed that one day he would find a way to return to the world of learning. Years later, Ricardo's family made the arduous journey to the United States in search of a better life. But the land of opportunity offered little more than grueling labor and cold indifference. Ricardo worked alongside his family in a factory, toiling for hours on end for meager pay. The language barrier made him a target for ridicule. His co-workers sneered at his broken English, mocking him openly. "Hey, Mexican, did you forget how to use soap?" one man jeered. Another added with a sneer, "You're wasting your time trying to learn English. You'll always be just another dumb immigrant." Each insult cut deep, but Ricardo refused to let the bitterness consume him. After each shift, he'd walk to the local library where he'd sit alone with books far above his reading level. He would sound out the words quietly, stumbling but persistent. The humiliation at work only fueled his determination. He didn't want their approval. He wanted to prove them wrong. One evening, as Ricardo struggled to decipher a book on American history, an elderly woman approached him. "You've been sitting here every night for weeks," she said, her voice kind but curious. "What are you working on?" Ricardo hesitated, embarrassed. "I'm trying to learn," he admitted, his accent thick. "I didn't get to go to school much." The woman, Mrs. Clara Watson, was a retired teacher who volunteered at the library. She saw the hunger in Ricardo's eyes, the same hunger she'd seen in so many students over her long career. Without hesitation, she sat beside him and began to explain the passages he struggled with. That night marked the beginning of a life-changing mentorship. "If you're willing to put in the effort, I'll help you," Mrs. Watson promised. "But you have to promise me one thing: never give up on yourself." Ricardo nodded. his heart swelling with hope for the first time in years. Ricardo's nights were now filled with lessons from Mrs. Watson. She taught him not only English, but also history, math, and critical thinking. She encouraged him to pursue his GED, even though Ricardo doubted himself. "How can I at my age?" he asked one night, his voice filled with doubt. "Because," Mrs. Watson replied, "your mind is sharper than most, and your heart is stronger than all." With her encouragement, Ricardo enrolled in GED classes. The road was far from easy. He worked long shifts during the day, studied at night, and endured mockery from coworkers who found out about his efforts. "What's the point, Ricardo? You'll never be one of them," they sneered. But Ricardo's resolve only deepened. He thought of his mother's words, his teacher's gift, and Mrs. Watson's belief in him. Slowly but surely, he began to excel, surprising even himself. The day he passed his GED, Ricardo sat in his car and wept. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a symbol of everything he had fought for. Ricardo's GED was more than an achievement. It was a turning point. For years, he had doubted his ability to keep up with others who had formal schooling. Now, with the certificate in his hands, he realized something profound. "I've climbed this far. Why stop now?" Mrs. Watson wasn't just proud, she was relentless. "Ricardo, you're going to college," she declared one evening. Ricardo nearly choked on his tea. "College? I barely made it through this," he protested, gesturing to his GED. "Exactly," she countered, her eyes blazing with determination. "You've already done the impossible. You're just getting started." Encouraged by her faith, Ricardo applied to the local community college. The application process was grueling. He struggled to write essays in English and had to explain gaps in his education. On top of that, the tuition was daunting, and his family, who relied on his income, was less than supportive. "College?" his father scoffed. "What's the point? You'll just end up back in the factory." But Ricardo didn't let the doubt sway him. When his acceptance letter arrived, he felt an overwhelming sense of pride. It was a small step, but it felt like the beginning of something monumental. Ricardo walked into his first college class with his head held high, but the challenges were immediate. He was older than most of his classmates, his English was still improving, and the coursework was far more advanced than he had anticipated. During one lecture, a student whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Is he the professor's assistant or someone's dad?" Another chimed in, "No way he's a student. Probably got lost on his way to the janitor's closet." Ricardo heard every word, and though it stung, he didn't let it deter him. Instead, he focused harder, studying late into the night, often with Mrs. Watson still guiding him over the phone. "Every word you learn, every page you read, it's a step closer to your dream," she reminded him. The turning point came during a group project in a sociology class. The professor paired Ricardo with two reluctant students who initially dismissed him as dead weight. But as the project progressed, Ricardo's insights drawn from his life experiences became invaluable. "Wait," one student said during a late-night brainstorming session, "you actually lived through this? That's incredible." And by the end of the semester, Ricardo had earned their respect and aced the project, proving not only to them, but to himself that he belonged. While Ricardo excelled academically, he struggled to see where his education could take him. That changed during a volunteer opportunity at a local community center. The center served children from immigrant families, many of whom faced language barriers and bullying at school. Ricardo was assigned to tutor a boy named Luis, a shy 10-year-old who refused to speak during their first session. Over time, Ricardo learned that Luis was embarrassed about his accent and terrified of making mistakes. "They laugh at me," Luis admitted one day, tears welling up in his eyes. "I'm stupid." Hearing those words hit Ricardo like a punch to the gut. He saw himself in Luis, scared, doubting, but full of untapped potential. Ricardo worked tirelessly with Luis, using creative methods like storytelling and games to make learning fun. Slowly, Luis began to open up, and one day, he read an entire paragraph aloud. "I did it, Mr. Ricardo!" he exclaimed, his face lighting up with pride. That moment was transformative for Ricardo. He realized that his journey wasn't just about proving others wrong. It was about helping kids like Luis believe in themselves. "I don't just want to learn," he told Mrs. Watson later. "I want to teach." Determined to become a teacher, Ricardo switched his major to education. The road ahead was steep. He had to complete additional certifications, navigate systemic bias, and compete against younger, more polished candidates. During one internship, a supervising teacher criticized his accent, saying, "You're a good role model, but how are you going to teach English when you're still learning it yourself?" Ricardo refused to let the comment shake him. Instead, he turned it into motivation. "If I can learn it," he thought, "I can teach it." He doubled down on his efforts, studying phonetics and grammar with an intensity that amazed his professors. Despite his progress, Ricardo faced rejection after rejection during job interviews. One principal openly questioned his qualifications. "You don't exactly fit the image of what our parents expect in a teacher." Another told him bluntly, "Your story is inspiring, but this district needs someone with more experience." The rejections were devastating, but Ricardo found solace in the community he had built. Former classmates, Mrs. Watson, and the families he had helped all rallied around him, urging him to keep going. "If anyone can break through, it's you," Mrs. Watson told him. Ricardo's perseverance paid off when a bilingual school in a struggling district finally gave him a chance. The school was underfunded, the students were disengaged, and the staff turnover was high. But Ricardo saw opportunity where others saw failure. On his first day, he stood in front of a room full of skeptical students. One boy muttered, "Great, another teacher who's just gonna leave." Ricardo responded with honesty, "I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you." His unconventional methods quickly won the students over. He incorporated bilingual lessons, blending English and Spanish to help students connect with the material. He shared his own story of struggle and resilience, inspiring even the most disinterested students. One particularly defiant student, Marisol, became his greatest challenge. She skipped class, mouthed off, and openly mocked Ricardo. "What do you know about struggle, old man?" she sneered. Instead of reprimanding her, Ricardo invited her to lunch and shared his story in depth. By the end of their conversation, Marisol was in tears. "No one's ever believed in me," she admitted. From that day forward, Marisol became one of Ricardo's strongest supporters, eventually graduating at the top of her class. Ricardo's impact extended beyond his classroom. He started a mentorship program for at-risk youth, pairing them with community leaders who could guide them academically and personally. He advocated for bilingual education, challenging the district to invest in resources for immigrant families. Parents began attending his workshops, learning how to support their children's education despite language barriers. Over time, the school's graduation rate soared, and Ricardo became a respected figure in the community. Years later, Ricardo received the district's Teacher of the Year award. As he stood on stage, he reflected on his journey. "This award isn't just for me," he said, his voice breaking. "It's for every child who's been told they're not good enough, every parent who's been told they don't belong, and every dreamer who refuses to give up." The audience erupted into applause, but Ricardo's focus was on the students in the front row, the ones who reminded him of Luis, Marisol, and his own younger self.